The research question that is behind this study has intrigued me for many, many years. Namely, the question is, what makes us humans? What is it in human behavior that we are perceived by other humans as humans? So in order to ask this question, one can actually implement human-like behavior in a machine and examine whether other humans would perceive this machine as being human-like or as being very mechanical. This is the key question behind my project that is funded by the European Research Council, the ERC. The title of the project is Instance, Intentional Stance for Social Attunement. And here the question is, do we attribute humanness or intentional agency to a machine, to a robot, and if so, under which conditions? So this is the background for this particular study. My interest in this study dates back to my fascination with the so-called Turing test. The idea that perhaps instead of asking whether a machine can be intelligent or not, we can ask a question of whether a human observer attributes intelligence to a machine or an AI in general, dependent on the way their interaction with that machine mechanistic system goes. So Turing has proposed this as a criterion for intelligence, and this is something that has been always a question of great interest to me, whether we can somehow translate this operationalization of intelligence into more general question about attribution of humanness to a machine or human-like behavior. Because this study is actually an adaptation, a version, non-verbal version of a Turing test, where we ask a question about behavior and behavioral characteristic of an artificial agent that exhibit human likeness. The next step would obviously be to design a little bit more complex behavior on the robot side, rather than just button presses, to have a more elaborate interaction with the human and see again what specific parameters of that interaction or that more complex behavior exhibits, let's say, parameters that are human-like or mechanical. The most exciting result of this study is that the human brain actually has sensitivity to such extremely subtle behaviors that manifest humanness. So if one thinks about this, these are very simple button presses, and this is the only data that our human participants have when they judge whether the robot is controlled by a human in another cabin or is pre-programmed. And yet those button presses and the way there is distributed, so that the timing of the button presses distributed across the experiment is enough for participants to detect human-like behaviors. And I think this is quite fascinating because that shows how our brain is attuned to the timing of behavior of other humans. It is a matter of discussion whether we actually do want to have robots that behave in a human-like way, because it might be a controversial issue. We might want to have human users perceive robots as robots, not as human-like entities. So this is something that needs to be explored in future research, is under which circumstances, what contexts would we actually want to have robots behaving in a very human-like way, or in such a way that humanness is attributed to those robots, and in what context we might want to make robot behavior exactly mechanistic and be perceived as just a robot. In this experiment, we were interested in whether the human brain has a sensitivity to subtle hints in behavior of others that would manifest humanness behind that behavior. And our results actually show that indeed our human brain is sensitive to those subtle hints. And this is important because this can provide guidelines to roboticists in how to design robot behaviors so that they appear more human, and in consequence, other humans will probably attune better to these kinds of behaviors and robots that are designed in this way, and will probably also be able to coordinate better as in other coordination and joint action tasks. We asked participants to perform a very, very simple task with a robot. And the task of participants was to respond to a color stimulus on the screen, so a green rectangle, while the robot was responding to a red rectangle. And the question of interest was whether people, just from simple pattern of button presses, so the way the robot was responding, reacting to the rectangles, would be able to discriminate that the robot was either pre-programmed, that was one condition of our experiment, or was teleoperated by another human in a different, seated in a different room. The way we pre-programmed our robot was that we actually took human behaviors, human reaction times from a previous experiment. We took the mean, and so the average of those reaction times and the standard deviation, and we modified slightly the way these reaction times were distributed. So in other words, the robot behaviors were very similar to human behaviors, but slightly different. The interesting question was whether this super subtle hint regarding humanness in just button presses would make people attribute humanness to the robot. And our results showed that when the human controlled the robot, the human in the other cabin controlled the robot, participants could actually discriminate that the robot was controlled by a human. In the robot condition, the computer programmed condition, people were uncertain whether the robot was actually controlled by a human or was pre-programmed. And now this shows altogether that there is a sensitivity in our brain to detect very subtle hints of humanness in the robot behavior. Now, why is that an important question? Because what we want to examine is what sort of impact does that have for social attunement with a machine. So if we design robots with these kind of very subtle behaviors that remind us of other human, whether that will make us humans interact with the robot better, more smooth, coordinate with the robot better. And this is something that's extremely important for the area of social robotics in general, where robots are supposed to interact with us on a daily basis.